Thanks a lot. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'll be talking about wage norm, capital accumulation, and unemployment. And I'll, for the most part, will give a post-Keynesian view of unemployment situated within an IRO framework or in an attempt to be as comparable with an IRO framework as possible. And I'll modify the standard post-Keynesian argument with a little bit of behavioral garnishing, and I'll try to use that to make a case for the endogeneity of the IRO. Now, let's first look at the creature. Let's look at the IRO as the European Commission thinks that the IRO in Ireland, Greece, and Spain has developed over the last years. And kindly enough, the European Commission makes its estimates readily available. And from these, we do learn that in the last 4 or 5 years, the, so to speak, equilibrium rate of unemployment in those countries has risen by 10 or more percentage points. In other words, there must have been a huge supply-side shock to these economies. Now, there's two basic reactions that you can have to that graph. The first one is that you can just say, well, this is plainly absurd. There happened to be a financial crisis that gave rise to a rise in unemployment, and what you see here, you should not worry too much about. The second attempt, which I will pursue, is say, well, there's actually something interesting to tell about the IRO model, and that it's the fact that it's essentially a bargaining model. And that we should just accept that the IRO is thoroughly endogenous, and therefore we should not at all be surprised by that. Whenever we have sustained increases in unemployment, we should expect also an increase in the IRO. Now, I will be making the case that the labor market is not a market as other markets. It's very different, and it's very different for two fundamental reasons. The first one is a little more obvious to sociologists and to Marxists than to economists, and that is that on the labor market we don't trade in normal commodities, but we actually trade in human beings. So it used to be called, it's a trade in labor power. And these human beings have feelings, they have motivations, they get self-esteem out of work or they don't, they get motivated by good pay and so on. They look at what other people are doing, they get self-esteem from getting a higher wage than their neighbor, and all other sorts of interesting things. The implication that I will draw from that in our context is that institutions and social norms matter, and in the economic exercise that I'll be doing, I'll be arguing that that will give rise to a very general case of hysteresis or of neuroendogeneity. The second reason why the labor market is different from other markets is that the labor market provides the incomes for most of the expenditures of the economy, of consumption expenditures in particular, and therefore the feedbacks of the labor market work via the goods market. It's not the type of market that you can analyze in isolation in a partial analysis framework. That is a very familiar Keynesian theme that the adjustments on the labor market via wages work themselves out over the goods market. So the presentation will be structured along the following lines. I'll say a few words on the IRO framework. I'll highlight that the IRO framework is essentially a bargaining framework where the labor market does actually not determine the level of employment or unemployment. It may determine the IRO, meaning the stable inflation rate of unemployment. I'll be arguing later that that is endogenous to economic activity. I'll also be careful in distinguishing between the IRO theory and the IRO story. I'll then make two Keynesian cases. First, I'll be making the case that we should not in general assume that the effective labor demand curve is downward sloping, and there's two essential reasons for that. One being that actual economies are often wage-led in income distribution, that is, an increase in wages relative to profits will in many cases stimulate aggregate demand. And the second is that inflation may have expansionary effects, the other way around, that deflation will typically have contractionary effects. Both of these mechanisms may give rise to effective labor demand curves that are not downward sloping. And in my story, I'll use that essentially to make a case that you should not expect the self-adjustment mechanisms on the labor markets to be very strong unless the central banks are willing and able to provide that adjustment mechanism. Third, I'll be making the case that social norms will give rise to hysteresis, and I'll be using hysteresis essentially synonymous with the endogeneity of the nairo. I'll basically be arguing that whatever wage level people find as on the labor market can, if only it persists for long enough, will be accepted as normal, and thus the wage bargaining curve will shift towards the actual employment real wage point that the economy is in, and that will give rise to unemployment hysteresis. That is a quite general argument for unemployment hysteresis. I will then go on and reiterate an old Keynesian argument that indeed empirically it is capital accumulation or investment expenditures that are the main driver of unemployment performance, and I will be presenting some empirical results on that. Fifth, one implication of introducing hysteresis on the labor market means that the determinants of equilibrium wages or equilibrium distribution on the one hand and the equilibrium unemployment rate get decoupled. In a standard nairo model, the same underlying factors will determine both sets of equilibrium values. Once you have hysteresis, the two can depart, and that is indeed what I find empirically, and if I haven't run out of time by then, I'll show you some empirical results on the determinants of income distribution. The nairo model. I regard as the defining and most interesting feature of the nairo model the fact that it does not assume an atomistic labor market. It's not your standard textbook macroeconomic labor market model, but it is at its core a bargaining model, and there's obviously different versions of that. And one of its key features will be that the actual level of employment is not determined on the labor market in these models, rather it's determined on the goods market. And the question is, if you're off equilibrium on the labor market, you will have some changes in prices and in wages. And the question is how these changes in wages and prices feed back onto the goods market, what their implications are for aggregate demand. I try to skip equations and restrict the presentations to figures. So here is one of the standard depiction of such a nairo labor market. We have a wage bargaining curve that summarizes the wage bargaining behavior between unions or workers, depending on the model on the one hand, and management on the other hand, and we have a price setting curve that is the price setting curve of a firm with market power. If we are off the equilibrium, which here is our E superscript A, the actual level of employment, the two of them don't match. And what the model then tells us that at that point we're going to have a wage price spiral or a price wage spiral going upwards. In other words, we have wage inflation as well as price inflation. We don't know a priori which direction real wages will change, and there's nothing in this labor market model that by itself tells you that you would be getting back to equilibrium. Rather, what you need in order to get back to equilibrium is a certain behavior on the goods market, and that behavior is essentially in these type of models then a regular downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Now, just to drive home the point that there's actually something interesting to be learned, or something interesting is being represented in this NIRO model, contrast that with a standard textbook labor market model, as most macroeconomic textbooks would have it in there. It has a labor supply function derived from preferences, not from a wage bargaining process, and it has a labor demand curve derived from the marginal product of labor, thus essentially technology. No market power involved here. It is a market like any other where the price mechanism is clearing the market, and the price at stake here is the real wage. Thus, this is a market in the real wage, and if you're off equilibrium, the real wage will change, and it thereby provides a mechanism by means of which you get back to equilibrium. Again, that's to highlight the difference to the NIRO model. I have emphasized that a crucial adjustment mechanism for the NIRO models is the question of, well, what happens once you're off equilibrium? What happens once you have wage inflation and price inflation? What does that do to aggregate demand? The standard aggregate demand curve, which I depict here as UIS, the unemployment rate as given by the IS relation, and I write it as a function on the one hand of inflation or price level, and on the other hand of income distribution, or if you prefer the real wage, to signal that these are the two variables that will give rise to either the standard IS curve or other IS curves. So from that point of view, the Keynesian question then is, well, what happens if you have inflation? How does inflation affect aggregate demand? And the NIRO literature is actually quite confusing on that. Substantial parts of the NIRO literature, essentially, in particular the Nickel-Laird textbook, do assume an exogenous money supply, and what creates the downward sloping IS curve is the fixed money supply. And the fact that an increase in prices reduces the real money supply. The more recent NIRO literature does not use an exogenous money supply, but uses an central bank reaction function. That has the big advantage of being more realistic, but of course it has the big disadvantage that a central bank reaction function is not a market mechanism. It's a policy mechanism. Effectively, these models say there's no market mechanism that would bring you back to equilibrium. Moreover, they give you a policy mechanism that will only work if inflation is high enough that the central bank can lower the interest rate sufficiently, which is why a lot of new Keynesians are now excited about the zero lower inflation bound. The second big issue is what the effect of a change in income distribution or real wages is. If we have unemployment and if we cut wages, what will that do to aggregate demand? And Keynes discusses that in length in chapter 19 of the general theory and makes a strong case that in general you cannot argue that a cut in wages will automatically lead to an increase in aggregate demand, and thus there's no reason a priori to assume that the labor demand curve is downward sloping. The second set, these are sort of more short-run questions. What happens if we are off equilibrium in a NIRO model? The second big question in the NIRO model is, well, how does the equilibrium unemployment itself change? And here the issue is really, well, once our actual unemployment deviates from equilibrium unemployment, what does equilibrium unemployment or the NIRO do? Does it stay put where it was, or does it start moving itself? And so in another paper of mine, I've been making the case that depending on these different closures, on how you think the changes in inflation or the price level affect aggregate demand, how you think the changes in income distribution affect aggregate demand, and whether you think that the NAIRU is exogenous or endogenous. You can get sort of a new Keynesian NAIRU model, which I identified with an exogenous NAIRU and a standard demand closure. You can have a post-Keynesian NAIRU framework where you have unstable short-run equilibria and an endogenous NAIRU in the long run, and so on. So the post-Keynesian view that I'll be putting forward is one where there's some use for the NAIRU. The NAIRU is really a short-run relation. It's another way of saying there is a short-run Phillips curve out there. If you want to reduce unemployment in the short run, you're likely to generate inflation. There's nothing bad about it. It's just going to happen. In this post-Keynesian view, I'll be arguing that the NAIRU is neither exogenous, it will be dragged along with actual unemployment, nor is it a particular strong attractor for the reason that I've outlined. Therefore, the NAIRU is really an outcome of economic performance rather than a determinant. It's a thermometer, it's not a thermostat. So let's look into the issue of whether effective labor demand is downward sloping. And the basic arguments I think I have already outlined. I just want to contrast again the standard argument why the labor demand ought to be downward sloping is a microeconomic one. It's a full capacity argument. It's about the declining marginal product of labor. Now, if you have an economy that is several percentage points below potential output, as economists present are, from a Keynesian point of view, of course, you're not on your production function. Thus, it doesn't really matter what your marginal product of labor is, because if you're not on your production function, you don't have to worry about it. The reason why one would expect the actual labor demand curve not to be downward sloping is, on the one hand, the fact that deflation will have contractionary effect, and on the other hand, the fact that there's a lot of evidence in the meantime that actual economies are often wage-led, meaning that an increase in the wage share can give rise to an increase in aggregate demand. That said, there's also all sorts of macroeconomic arguments why the standard labor demand curve may not be applying. Card and Kruger's paper is a famous one in that direction. The oligopsonistic labor market models of Manning are another type. So there's the whole family of microeconomic arguments why the standard labor demand curve may not be applying. What we have here are some of the estimates in the work that I myself was involved in estimating the demand effects of changes in income distribution. And the one with the yellow backgrounds are the one for the euro area, a relatively closed economy. And there we estimated that a 1 percentage point increase in the wage share would lead to a roughly 0.4 percentage point increase in consumption expenditures and would have relatively minor negative effects on investment in net exports, and thus overall aggregate demand is wage-led. And there's indeed a rich, sizable neo-Kaleckian literature that tries to estimate these types of models that in principle allow wage-led as well as profit-led demand regimes. Thus, what I conclude from there is that in general, I expect perverse or at best very weak adjustment on the labor market if it is in equilibrium. If there is an adjustment along the lines as standard models will tell you, it's essentially driven by the central bank, and to what extent that will be effective will depend on economic circumstances such as the level of inflation, but also on the extent to which households are indebted. George Akerlof, in his presidential address, I thought had a very interesting case for a series of Keynesian arguments. But the point that I want to make here is that his arguments about the importance of social norms for economic outcome extends in a fairly straightforward way to the issue of unemployment hysteresis. And the argument that I'll be making is that there's no objective iron-cast benchmarks by which workers could evaluate the disutility of their labor, and rather how they perceive of their wage, to what extent they regard a certain wage level as satisfactory, depends a lot on what other people are earning. It depends on social comparisons. An implication of that is that essentially any wage level that's out there, if it persists for long enough, can become the conventional or the normal wage, and thus in the Nairo model the wage bargaining curve will shift towards the point where actual real wages are. Now, in the type of unemployment persistence model, that introduces one big difference compared to the standard analysis of unemployment persistence. And the standard discussion of unemployment persistence, I'm referring again to the Laird and Nickel book, is ingenious in a way because it allows for unemployment persistence in a limited extent as the normal case, but reduces proper hysteresis phenomena to a very rare special case. And the way that it's doing that is that it's essentially saying that, well, if we have unemployment persistence, that is due to the long-term unemployed, or the people who have been unemployed for a while, having a weaker effect on the wage level than the currently or the recently unemployed people. Thus, it really comes down to an issue of not enough wage flexibility, and the really poor guys, the long-term unemployed, not exercising enough downward pressures on wages. That mechanism also has a built-in, or that story also has a built-in mechanism why we should be getting back to our original wage bargaining curve. And that is what I've tried to depict in the diagram here. So assume that we start out at the equilibrium T0. For whatever reason, we got kicked off to equilibrium, to the non-equilibrium point T1. We have some amount of long-term unemployment. Thus, the slope of our wage bargaining curve is changing. The curve is rotating. Why is it rotating? Well, because we have long-term unemployed, and these guys are not exercising enough wage pressure. As our economy is moving back towards equilibrium, the number of long-term unemployed gets fewer and fewer, and thus our wage bargaining curve is rotating back where it used to be. The story that I'm trying to tell is one where it's not an issue of the unemployed exercising not enough downward pressure on wages, but people getting used to the wage level that's out there. Therefore, I don't get a change in the slope of the wage bargaining curve, and I don't get the backward rotation of the wage bargaining curve. Rather, the extent to which the wage bargaining curve shifts out in parallel depends on how long we are off our original unemployment and thus wage level, and our wage bargaining curve will keep moving until it reaches actual unemployment. So the question in a way becomes, which of the two is adjusting faster? How long do we stay in the high unemployment situation? How long does equilibrium unemployment or the Nairo have time to move towards actual unemployment and actual wage levels? Now that is a quite general mechanism, and I should say for fairness that while I thought that I've had this brilliant idea, indeed it goes back to a paper by Peter Scott published in 2005, and it may well be that someone else had the argument earlier. Now, the story that I've given you is perfectly consistent with Keynes's analysis, it doesn't say anything about what shock is driving the initial displacement of unemployment and real wages. And indeed, a lot of the post-Keynesian literature has been about establishing much more specific hysteresis or neuroendogeneity mechanism centered around investment expenditure and the capital stock. Bob Roththorn and Philip Arestes, as well as Eckhard Hein, have done interesting work on that. I have about 5 minutes, is it?
Maximum.
Right. Then, very briefly, some empirical results. What I want to show you is some results on explaining unemployment coming from a paper I've co-authored with Eric Clare, which was written in 2008 but came out in 2011. And essentially we are trying to use a framework that's as close as possible to the standard NIRO framework. In particular, we're essentially doing what Blanchard and Wolfers did in a 2000 paper, and we are adding capital accumulation because we're very unsatisfied with what they're doing with aggregate demand. And what we get when we do that, and that is using the same data set that the OECD has been using for its 2006 employment outlook, meaning its most recent, at least at the time, labor market institution data set. We are controlling for the standard control variables of Blanchard and Wolfers, and then we are adding capital accumulation. And the paper has various variations on that, on how exactly you introduce capital accumulation. And you do find consistently that labor market institutions don't explain much. However, capital accumulation explains a whole lot. That figure tries to illustrate that. The pink bar is the contribution of capital accumulation to changes in unemployment. So we are sort of saying, well, think of the early 60s as being fairly close to full employment, and then compared to that for the average, hypothetical average country of our panel, with our parameter estimates and the actual change in the underlying variables, what does explain changes in unemployment performance? And you see that capital accumulation is by far the largest influence. You also do see the green bar, that's the real interest rate. The real interest rate here is indeed, as in almost all empirical studies, has a strong and statistically significant positive effect on unemployment, or in this setup on the NIRO. It is just that much of the mainstream literature doesn't seriously discuss that finding, but it's actually not specific to our study. It's in the OECD, IMF, and what have you studies. 2 minutes, I presume. In more recent work that I've done for the ILO, I'm looking at the determinants of income distribution, thus what is sort of our real wage or wage share in this framework, and we find a very different set of variables that are influencing income distribution, and that is one of the important implications if you have unemployment hysteresis or neuroendogeneity, that you will get different sets of that you can have different sets of determinants for the two. In the standard NIRO framework, you would not get that. And in that, we do find that financialization, and here it's really the international financial globalization, the international aspect of financialization, for which we found strongest effects, has been the main driver of the decline in the wage share. Welfare state retrenchment and globalization have also had effects. We find rather minor effects of technological change. Now, we have tried to flip the dependent variable, and indeed those variables are not performing particularly well in explaining unemployment and vice versa. So it is the case that there's different set of variables determining that. So what are the policy conclusions of that? I started out with NIRO data from the European Commission, so let me end on a note by the OECD, which in the Employment Outlook 2006 said that, on average, extremely different degrees of interventionism, by that essentially means welfare state generosity, in almost each selected policy area may lead to very similar employment and unemployment rate. This suggests that there is not a single road for achieving good employment performance. Another way of saying that the standard labor market institutions that we tend to preach really are not driving the show. That is a key analytical finding of the OECD in that report. The only problem with it is it never makes its insight into the policy chapters of that very report, which just reiterate that what you have to do if you want to get back to full employment, which is by and large what the European Commission will tell you these days, is you have to cut unemployment benefit, get rid of collective bargaining coverage, and all these things. So the sort of analysis, the role of the state that my story around Keynesian themes of aggregate demand and perverse aggregate demand functions and of conventional wages is a very different one. In that approach, labor market institutions are not just market imperfections. There's a good reason that they are there. What the Nairo model is telling you is that there's a distributional conflict being fought out on the labor market, which is what is giving rise to wage and price inflation. A big part of labor market institutions and of government intervention is mediating this social conflict. The second big part of the role of government then, of course, becomes stabilizers. If the system itself does not tend towards desirable levels of employment, then we need the state doing so. The third interesting findings of these types of models is that, of course, reiteration of an old Keynesian insight, if you have a crisis with high unemployment, you don't want to cut wages. You want to keep wages growing with trend inflation and with trend productivity in order to allow for stable aggregate demand via consumption expenditures.